feedthepig.org for more.
About 10 seconds.
feedthepig.org. This message brought to you by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and the Ad Council.
The following views are those of the host and not those of Clear Channel Broadcasting licenses. Welcome to CareGiver Reality with your host, Dr. David Levy. Dr. Levy brings more than 25 years of practical experience helping thousands of family caregivers find solutions to the challenges and the frustrations presented by this important responsibility. So if you are in the position of caring for a spouse, a parent, or a loved one who's no longer able to care for him or herself, or if you know someone who is, this hour will be worth the listening. Now, today's edition of CareGiver Reality and your host, Dr. David Levy.
Good evening, Florida, America, and the world. This is the CareGiver Reality Show. I'm your host, David Levy, gerontologist. I'm here tonight, as always, with my co-host, Paul.
Good evening, David.
All right, and this is our second show from WBZT, 1230 a.m. If you'd like to speak to us and you're local, it's 561-844-6167. And if you're out there and listening to us on iHeart or you're on caregiverreality.com, we're at 800-889-0267. That's 889-0267. And we'd like to hear from you. But if you just want to listen, that's perfectly fine as well. For those of you that didn't start with us last week or don't know who we are, Paul and I not only are spousal caregivers for our wives. I have been supporting caregivers since, the last 25, 26 years. I write, I research, I run support groups every week. Paul is an educator. He's very involved with families that need assistance. And between the two of us, also being caregivers, we try and give you the straight skinny, and if there is such a thing. So we're about real caregivers. When we tell you things, it's because we've done the research, and we're not about sound bites, and we're not about sensationalism. We're about trying to help the family caregiver, the informal family caregiver, the 50 to 60 million of you out there who are unpaid doing a job every day that whether you signed up for it or not, you got to do it. And there are a lot of tips and techniques and things, but most importantly, we want you to know that the purpose of this show is directed at the family caregiver and to let you know you're not alone. We may not be able to come out there personally and help you, but we're certainly going to give it a try. The CareGiverReality.com website has a lot of past shows, not just last week, but we were doing them on another station before we moved up here. So there's a good bit of information that you can see. There's a lot of printed information. One of the things I want you to realize is when we talk about caregiving, we don't talk about it specific to any disease. It could be Alzheimer's, it could be lupus, it could be cancer. Caregiving is caregiving, and while you need to know about the disease so that you understand what your loved one is going through, caregiving is a whole other animal. And as I said last week, and will repeat always, we put a bright blue line down the middle. Doctors, clinicians, psychiatrists, etc., treat the patient. Caregiving is not a disease. We don't treat it as a disease, but that's not to say at times people don't get stressed out and need a mental health professional to help them go through that stress. But the bottom line is, when you get to the bottom of why you're stressed, I'm stressed because I'm a caregiver, and what do I do? And unfortunately, the clinical profession does not educate their people in family caregiving. Hopefully going forward, because of the tremendous amount of caregiving that's happening in an aging world, in an aging America, and with more and more chronic disease, I think it's going to become essential that we start to teach caregiving both to the professional, and I think it needs to start in high school as well, because most of the world are going to be caregivers. Either they have been, they are, or they will be again. And so with that thought in mind, I want to welcome everybody to the show. And Paul, good evening again.
And David, how was your week as a caregiver?
My week as a caregiver was very difficult. My wife is trying to get into physical therapy, which she's doing now, in order to be able to have knee surgery. But her condition is such, her underlying chronic condition, which is called dysautonomia, and I won't bother the audience with what that's all about, but is very difficult. She's having a hard time, and besides the fact that her knee has become more and more immobile and trying to do PT, she's coming home exhausted. She spent the better part of the day today on the couch watching the Olympics. I'm not sure that she didn't want to do that. And my 4 dogs kept her company. So I just want you to know out there that we're very normal. We have a bloodhound, 2 dachshunds, and a teddy bear Pomeranian, who all are assistant caregivers and take very good care of my wife when I can't be around. But it's been a very troubling week. And a month from today, she has her knee surgery. And obviously, we can't do it with anesthesia, but we're going to do it with what they call spinal blocks and pain blocks. And hopefully it will be successful, because if not, I am fearful that she's not going to be able to walk in the near future, and that has me terribly concerned. And your week at caregiving?
As with all caregivers, it's always an up and a down in caregiving. Had a scare the other night with my wife, Debbie. As you know, and some of our previous listeners, Debbie has lupus and has been with lupus now, I guess it's almost 4 years. And we had gone to bed as we do every other night, and 10 minutes later, I hear a thump, and Debbie's on the floor.
Wow.
She didn't know how she got there, but the really scary part of it was, I mean, there's a nightstand there. It's a wood floor. There's the bed with a metal bottom on it, and she's laying on the floor. And Debbie is an RN. So
a registered nurse.
Yeah, a little bit of knowledge there.
Right, which can be dangerous.
It can be dangerous. So the first thing I jump up and I tell her is, don't move. Stay where you are. Let's assess what's going on. So do you want to take a guess, David, exactly what happened at that point?
Well, I know what happened because I know your wife and I know my wife. I could tell her to stay on the floor until we did an assessment, and she'll say, no, I'm getting up. And I'm sure that's exactly what Debbie did.
She did. And not knowing what might be broken, what might be fractured.
If she had a concussion.
A head injury. We didn't see any blood, but it doesn't mean there wasn't something internal. But she worked her way up onto the bed and started then to self-assess as to what's going on. And I was a little puffy. Her head was bruised. Hematoma on her arm started to blood under the skin.
Under the skin, for those of you that are not as skilled in clinical terminology.
And 2 knees that hurt really badly. And since one of her problems had been neck injuries very high up on the spine, that had been re-aggravated also. So the next few days after that, it really was recovering. And for those out there who are caregivers, one of the things that we fear the most for our loved ones is a fall.
Yeah. The fall is usually the event that precipitates so many things or starts so many things that we never realize. Somebody can be perfectly healthy and take a fall. I know exactly what that's about. There's nothing wrong with my health. And 5 months ago, I took a horrific fall. I was lucky I didn't break anything, but I am still recovering. And tomorrow, as you know, not only did it pop my whole bridge out of my mouth, and I've had a temporary, but tomorrow is bone grafts and implants. So it is not the day I'm looking forward to, but I got to make some forward progress with this. But it really was a life-changing event, and I was very lucky I didn't break anything, but the consequences of it have really been very difficult. And I have so many caregivers who the story starts, my loved one got up, and fell. And, when they fall on their face, many times it's because they've had a little stroke and they don't know how to get their arms out in front of them. So the next day, not only are they dealing with the stroke, but they kind of look like, a monkey. And but slip and fall and a broken hip is usually the beginning. I don't care how old or how young you are. Usually the beginning of a decline. When you're older and your body, and I can tell you as a gerontologist, even healthy folks with normal aging still have an older body. And your response to medication, your response to healing, your response to physical therapy is all very relative to your age as well as your condition. So we can't just assume, because we think we feel good, that our bodies necessarily are ready to take up and do what we could do when we were 30 that we can't do when we're 75.
And that really is the moment of decision, because as the caregiver, in Debbie's case, I'm looking at her, and I know intellectually the right move was to grab the cell phone and call 911 and get someone there who really knew. As a husband and a caregiver whose wife was very upset, it's very hard at that moment to objectively do what you know is the right thing when the one who is on the floor, who you love, is telling you, I don't need it, I don't need it. Right. And that's the dilemma that so many of us who are caregivers face every day on an ongoing basis.
And I know that for a fact because over this past 2013, I had 3 events with my wife who wound up on the floor, and I wouldn't let her get up, and I called 911. And in each of those events, I was so pleased that, I don't mean pleased for the fact that it happened, but so pleased that 911 was there in a heartbeat. They knew exactly what they were doing. They got her to the hospital, and in 2 instances, I was darn glad she was in the hospital, because if we had left it to, I'll be okay, just get me up off the floor, we would have had some real difficult problems ongoing. And I want to say to the audience out there, don't be afraid to call. That's what 911 is there for. When you have a situation that's above your pay grade, that's beyond what you've seen before, you need to have competent help. Get in there in a hurry. There's so many things that caregivers have to do day in and day out in terms of taking care of their loved one. But when you have an acute event like a bad slip and fall, or somebody that's running a nasty fever, or that all of a sudden is in pain and you can't figure out why, don't try and push it off. Don't try and leave it because you don't think you can afford to do something. I'm not getting into affordable care or anything else, but if the well-being of your loved one is foremost in your mind, you got to get them to the ER and get them assessed. You don't want to deal with the consequences of just saying, no, I can't, no, I won't.
But there's a part B to the story, because having mentally processed all that went on and looking retroactively back at 2013 and 12, I began to realize that I had put a lot of my own medical things on the back burner because I wasn't the priority, because the criticality of what was going on with Debbie at the time was there. So in my role as a caregiver, this was the week that I started to take care of myself, and I set my own appointments to get the dermatological visit, to get the eyes checked, to do the types of things that we should all be doing, but we tend not to because we're thinking of our loved one first.
And that's what we see in our support groups all the time. People coming in, and you can easily tell that they have neglected their own well-being in the course of taking care of another. And, caregiving is difficult enough as it is without clearly understanding all the things that are needed and what you have to do. Compound it with the fact that you are not feeling well, or you are dealing with issues about your own health that you pushed aside because you don't think there's time for it. is a mistake that most caregivers make. So I say to all caregivers that are out there, you do your loved one no benefit by getting sick, by having an illness that doesn't allow you to effectively take care of them or do what you need to do, and getting stressed out and having a heart attack or predeceasing your loved one, which can happen in many, many cases, only means that now others have to step in, or that now there are two people to take care of, you and your loved one, because you carried yourself beyond your ability to maintain yourself, and now you've got more of a problem going.
And that goes back to what we started to speak about last week, about some of the emotions or the feelings that accompany caregiving. Because one of the things was, I felt guilty about taking time away from the things I should be doing at home in order to go for the doctors for myself. But then remembering what they say on the airplanes, when the oxygen mask drops, you put it on yourself first.
Because you're no good to anybody if you pass out. And that's a lesson we all need to learn as caregivers. We have to put ourselves first. It's not that it's to the detriment of our loved one, but honest to God, folks, you know and I know that if you're feeling lousy, you can't do a good job. Mm-hmm. And whether you're taking care of somebody at home or whether you're worrying about them on the job, it's very stressful. It's very difficult. We don't have a caregiver gene, I say that over and over again, that blossoms just because we're a caregiver. And the skill sets that we need as a caregiver are not things that we typically have done before in our lives, and are a completely different way of having to approach things. When you're dealing with the system, when I say system, I'm talking about medical, political. It doesn't make a difference what it is. Trying to make things happen just because you need them to happen doesn't make life easier. And, you know, one of the things you have to understand is, how do you move around in the system, get yourself in? You know, we talked about last week, and then I want to get back to Paul, but we talked about that study that was done of geriatric, which means elderly, healthcare professionals who had to be caregivers to their spouses, and they were no better off than the rest of us. They got burned out, they were confused, and they didn't like having to go back into the system that they came from, the wrong door. And nobody was any more cooperative simply because you had doctor in front of your name, and in many cases, they didn't know you were a doctor. And it didn't make a difference because they're going to run their thing the way they want it to run. Paul?
And that really it's frustrating, because a simple thing like trying to reach someone on a phone, getting through their phone system, getting the right person on the phone, having to say the same problem 5 or 10 times, it really gets to the point where you're ready to pull your hair out, but yet that's such an integral part of what we as caregivers all have to do. And for those who are listening out there who feel that frustration, please know that you are not alone. That system is really hard to penetrate for even those of us who do it all the time.
Right. And I was hearing today, a couple of my clients called and they said, you know, we had a referral from our doctor to go to see specialist X, Y, and Z. And that specialist wouldn't see us unless we were willing to pay cash. But last year there was no problem. And I said to them, the managed care organizations and Medicaid, whether it's Medicaid, Medicare, or your insurance, are dropping people from the panels. They're dropping providers because they think they're too expensive. They think their procedures are too expensive, and they don't want to have to reimburse at that level. We all know that Medicare, Medicaid are essential elements of those over the age of 65. Mm-hmm. However, remember, they are controlled, except for fee-for-service, regular ordinary Medicare. They're controlled by insurance companies, and insurance companies still have to make a profit, still have a bottom line, and are still accountable to their shareholders. So remember, they're not thinking about you as much as they're thinking about what their stock looks like at the end of the day or the end of the quarter or the next reporting period. I don't mean to be cynical, but those of you that have come up against the system and know that to be the case, and I'm telling you that it is, you have to be a darn good advocate. You have to be very creative in order to be able to get done what needs to be done. And you need to be an effective squeaky wheel. Now, I'm not saying you need to be a pain in the butt, because that gets you nowhere. But you have to be an effective advocate for your loved one, because they can't do it for themselves. And don't take the first answer of no as the final answer being no. You need to go in and say why. If you're not happy with the answer, tell them you want to speak to the next person up the food chain. And if you can't get a good answer, then you ask, who's running the house, which is what we normally say about hospitals. And if they say, well, there's nobody here, you can tell them that's BS, because somebody always has to be running it. Same thing for a nursing home. Same thing for assisted living. Do not take a no when you know you need an answer. And so, folks, we're going to take a break in just a moment, but you can see us on caregiverreality.com. You're listening to us on WBZT 1230 AM, and you're listening to us on iHeartRadio. So we're being heard around the world, and we're very, very pleased to be a leader in caregiving and what you need to know. And we'll be back with some more information in just a moment. So take that break.
Are you a family caregiver? Are you taking care of a spouse?
There's no music for that, for going into the break. So whenever you're ready to, whenever you stop talking, I'll go.
Stressed, frustrated, and you just don't know where to turn. You've tried doctors, you've tried lawyers and mental health professionals, but now realize they don't have
30 seconds.
What you need is an expert non-clinical family caregiver, one with 25 years of active experience helping thousands of family caregivers like yourself, one who can help you provide a better quality of life for yourself and your loved one. His name is David Levy, and you can reach him at dlevy@caregivered.org. Caregiver ED is one word, or call direct to 561-482-0086. That's 561-482-0086. This is Caregiver Reality with gerontologist Dr. David Levy. You can call in to speak with Dr. Levy on air, toll-free at 1-800-889-0267. That's 1-800-889-0267. Again, here's Dr. Levy and more of today's Caregiver Reality.
We're back. That was a quick break. I want to remind you all that if you're local in the Palm Beach area, we're at 561-844-6167. And if you're out there in the big wide world, it's 800-889-0267. If you can't get a call into us, because some people say we're just fascinated with what you have to say, and so we don't bother to interrupt you, you can send us an email at info@caregiverreality.com. And we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And caregiverreality.com is a website designed exclusively for the caregiver. We've got a lot of video on there. We've got support groups on there, things that you can see, things that you can learn from. There's a lot of printed information. I know people don't like to go back to school, but there are things you just need to learn how to do. And there's no other way to do it except to read it, hear it, and then practice what you're doing. Caregiving is not easy, it's not intuitive, and it creates a tremendous amount of guilt, anger, and resentment when you try and do it and things just don't work. And I'll tell you, as I've said before, and I'll say it again to all those caregivers out there, just when you think that things are going smoothly is when things go upside down. No different whether Paul found his wife, falling on the floor, or incidences that I have as a caregiver, and each and every one of you out there know exactly what I'm talking about. The best laid plans just happen to go astray with caregiving. And don't be afraid to ask for help. The problem is, it's not easy sometimes to find it, especially for those of you that are out there a little bit in the hinterlands. You may be lucky that you even have a rural hospital within X miles, let alone have a support group. Or the ability to get to the kind of folks that can give you good advice. That's what we're trying to do here on the air. and on the website. So please take advantage of that. Don't be afraid, because you're going to have to deal with that caregiving whether you like it or not. And the smarter you are, the wiser are your decisions. And he who understands what his options are, even if they're lousy, at least has the comfort of knowing that they did the best they could with what they had at the time they had to do it, and not have to second guess themselves. By the same token, as the primary caregiver, you get subjected to a lot of criticism at times from other siblings, outsiders, neighbors, whatever, that there's a better way to do it. But remember, you're the one in the trenches doing it. You're the one that has to make those calls. You're the one that has to be around and be accountable. So don't be intimidated. You've got a very responsible obligation, and you need to do it the way you see it happening, and we're here to support you.
David, we speak often about Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive impairment, and we're familiar with these terms. For many people, they see them as being synonymous. Perhaps it might be helpful for you to actually break that down. What exactly are the differences between each of those impairments?
All right, and understand that we're not focusing all the time on dementia. Now, dementia is an umbrella term, and it means people that have difficulty in how their brains work, in putting things together, making things logical, possibly being able to speak, recall, where am I, who am I? And so underneath that umbrella of dementia are 47 different kinds of dementia. Dementia of the Alzheimer's type, Parkinson's dementia, sometimes called Lewy body dementia, temporal frontal lobe dementia, and on and on. We're not here to give a clinical course in it. Usually the thing that happens that we see first is something that's called mild cognitive impairment. When it's real mild cognitive light, we all have a tendency to call it a senior moment.
I've had a couple of those.
Yes, well, we all have, and every one of us has gone down an alphabetical list trying to remember some actor that we saw on TV or somebody that used to be a friend and now we can't think of their name. In the normal course of aging, there's nothing wrong with that. Exactly. I like to say that at age 40, you had 40,000 books in your library, and at age 70, you got 70,000 books in your mental library. It takes a little longer to run around and get to the right book.
And sometimes they get lost in the process.
Absolutely. But understand that mild cognitive impairment, when it reaches a point where it's noticeable to others and consistent, it's time to go and have somebody that has more skills than you do to understand what's happening. We have been following for the last, almost a year now, a doctor. We mentioned him last week. His name is Dr. David Hilfiker. He's in Washington, D.C. He's a medical doctor who started to blog a couple of years ago. The blog was named When the Lights Go Out, because he was having cognitive impairment. He couldn't remember where his keys were. He couldn't remember that he had driven 2 states over from where he lived to visit a friend who was incarcerated in prison until the prison chaplain said, "I've seen you here twice," and he couldn't remember it. Mm-hmm. And so he went and had himself tested at the National Institute of Health, since he was right there in Washington, D.C. And it came back that he did have cognitive impairment, and that what they felt was that it was almost certain that he was going to have Alzheimer's. Since then, he has discovered that he doesn't have Alzheimer's, because another good friend of his, who happened to have been a psychologist, reread the testing and said, "You do not have Alzheimer's." And since that time, he feels a weight lifted off of him, because at least he's not waiting for Alzheimer's to happen. Now, I sent him an article that appeared in the last few weeks about a study that was done in Minnesota in a place called Olmsted County, which is where the Mayo Clinic resides. And what they did is they had, somewhere around 2,700 people, of which about 520, the numbers aren't that critically important, that had mild cognitive impairment. And one of the things that they were trying to understand better is something that we call reverter. Some of these people with mild cognitive impairment never progressed beyond mild cognitive impairment. And in many cases, they actually improved in their capabilities brain-wise. There were 65% of the folks that they called initially reverter, 40% rather. 65% of that 40 went on to have a dementia, typically of the Alzheimer's type, but there was a group that didn't. And so we're trying to understand better, and I think what Dr. Hilfiker said in his last blog 2 days ago, he wasn't cured, he just didn't have it to begin with because it was a bad diagnosis. So if he didn't have it to begin with, nobody can cure it. And what they said was it was almost certain that he'd probably get it. The problem is that the diagnostic or the ability to figure out what it is, the criteria for Alzheimer's, is very subjective. Just when you take those tests, it's how somebody interprets the test, how good you felt that day, what else was going on in your life. So by the old criteria, he probably had it. Now they're getting to a point where they're putting new criteria into place. Now, that's not to say that if you have Alzheimer's, you don't have Alzheimer's. I'm not saying that at all. But there are some people that have what's called mild cognitive impairment that do not progress to having Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, dementia, whatever else it may be. But one of the things that we need to realize is that when we see mild cognitive impairment getting more serious, if it is related to Alzheimer's, we have to remember that that Alzheimer's has been percolating for maybe 15 or 20 years. And so when we see it, we can't ignore the fact that it isn't part of Alzheimer's disease. And so that's why you need to get to a good professional, a neurologist, who will not only do what we call psychometric testing, which is determining whether you have cognitive difficulties, but also do the right kind of brain scan to see whether or not your brain is shrinking, if you have plaquing and other markers that we're now beginning to feel show that. That's not to say that we have anything on the near horizon to be able to cure or slow down Alzheimer's, but we're working very hard in that direction. But a caregiver not only needs to know for himself, but for his loved one, exactly what they're dealing with. Many times, and this is no casting doubt on anybody, but many times your general practitioner, who really isn't skilled in Alzheimer's, will say, well, that's what you got, and because you're forgetful, or maybe they did what's called a mini-mental, and a lot of times they're very accurate, but a lot of times they miss the mark. So you really do want to get a second opinion, and I think that both Dr. Hilfiker, who said, gee whiz, I don't have Alzheimer's, but I probably have something else because my cognitive impairment is too serious to ignore. They just haven't been able to find out the reason why. And that study in Minnesota with the Mayo Clinic essentially said the same thing. Even when people didn't come back to the study, almost everybody in Olmsted County is treated in some form or another by Mayo Clinic or one of their medical extensions. So they were able to track these people and see exactly what went on. So it's a pretty accurate study. So we have to remember that when we hear people talk about mild cognitive impairment, we're talking about memory, word finding. If we lose our sense of direction, all of a sudden you're in a store where you've always shopped and you don't realize what row and you've been there for years. Then it's time to take a look. You know, it's not always because you can't find your car. That sometimes takes a little memory jogging. Like if you're in row B2. You know, you have to say to yourself, because 2, or whatever it is, blame row 2, so that it jogs your memory a little bit when you walk out, you know you're looking for B2. But there are a lot of things that affect what mild cognitive impairment can come to. And they're both biological, which is obvious, physical health. I cannot tell you how important it is, both for your loved one and yourself, just as we talked about a few moments ago, the caregiver staying healthy, how important it is, because so many factors can weigh on that cognitive impairment. Nutrition, physical health, emotional distress. Let's face it, folks, anybody that has a chronic illness can't be laughing and jumping up and down. So we have to take a look at depression. We have to take a look at things that affect mood. And this is very, very important, and something that every caregiver needs to know. So you're not alone, and you really need, even if you're living in the burbs, you need to seek out good advice, because if you don't know what you're dealing with, then it's almost impossible to plan out what's coming.
Sounds like a second opinion is really a necessity.
I believe that when it comes to cognitive impairment, because we saw what happened with Dr. Hilfiger.
Yes.
Even though he went to the top of the mountain in the National Institute of Health, when they came to doing his psychological testing, it was all interpreted by the person who was reviewing it. And everybody has biases, the way they look at data. And so there's not to say that any one person is the definitive answer. And before you allow yourself to feel that you've got something as difficult as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, you sure do want a second opinion. So everybody out there that thinks they're dealing with something beyond just a little senior moment, by all means, hear what your doctor has to say, but don't take that as the final decision until you've gotten a second opinion.
And sometimes you have to travel to get that second opinion. Our listeners all over the United States and beyond don't necessarily have access, as we're fortunate enough to here, as you said earlier, in Palm Beach County, but they need to search out those centers of excellence to get that second opinion.
Right. Let's face it. If you're living in an area that really doesn't understand cancer, one of the places that you usually wind up getting an opinion from is MD Anderson in Houston, Texas, which is considered to be one of the finest cancer facilities in the country. Mm-hmm. They've got people there that have seen just about everything. That doesn't mean they can cure everything that they've seen, but at least you know you're getting a diagnosis and an opinion. Just the same as with the Mayo Clinics and Johns Hopkins, centers of excellence where you have academic as well as good clinical care coming together, gives you a better opportunity to understand what you have, to be able to plan what your loved one may be going through, and get yourself ready for how things may unfold.
And that really is what an advocate is to do for those who are caregivers. We are advocates for the ones that we care for.
Absolutely, because we cannot assume that they can advocate for themselves. And when we do deal with Alzheimer's, we absolutely know that our loved one cannot go in the condition that they may be in terms of their brain, their ability to speak, their ability to put things together, and deal with the doctors, deal with the insurance companies, deal with the paperwork, figure out what it is that they're going to do. And as caregivers, we become advocates for our loved ones. We are their voice. We are their logic. We are the people that are thinking for them. And if we have not been down the path that they're going through, I'm not saying have the disease, but if you have not advocated for somebody that has a chronic illness and you're trying to deal with the system and everything else that we talk about, one of the things that you need to do is gain some education. And so that always gives me the opportunity for 7 seconds to bring up, I got to make sure you can all see it. What we have here is the Family Caregiver Practical Problem Solving Manual. This is a manual that I put together. Last year it won the Florida Council on Aging Gold Award for the best media. And right now, we're in the process of, and I spent the whole weekend getting it ready for Kindle, which is enough to have to send you back to the eye doctor. But in here are the basics of caregiving. It's not what I did. It's not what Paul did. It's what we've learned over a quarter of a century of dealing with caregivers. What makes up the basics of caregiving? What do you need to know? What's the foundation? How do I build that caregiving house so that it's going to be strong and we understand what to do?
It's a toolbox.
It's a toolbox. That's exactly what it is. It also helps you create a plan unique to your circumstances so that you, once again, have a better understanding of what you're dealing with. So when you have decisions to make, whether it's placing somebody, whether it's making a surgical decision, whether it's hospice, end of life, I don't care what it is, you need to plan. You just can't do it willy-nilly off the seat of your pants. And we can't say that often enough. It's about 7:45, and I think we'll take one more station break so that when we come back, I've got a couple interesting things that Paul and I have been doing that we want to get into, and so take it away.
Are you a family caregiver? Are you taking care of a spouse, parent, or loved one who can no longer care for him or herself? Are you dealing with Alzheimer's disease and don't know what to do? Are you feeling burned out, stressed, frustrated, and you just don't?
I'm going to pop out that last break or spot block because I'm assuming we're not taking another one.
Realistic, practical answers. What you need is
About 30 seconds, you're back on.
Family Caregiver, one with 25 years of active experience helping thousands of family caregivers like yourself. One who can help you provide a better quality of life for yourself and your loved one. His name is David Levy, and you can reach him at dlevy@caregivered.org. Caregiver ED is one word. Or call
5 seconds to the rejoiner.
562-0086. That's 561-482-0086. This is Caregiver Reality with gerontologist Dr. David Levy. You can call in to speak with Dr. Levy on air toll-free at 1-800-889-0267. That's 1-800-889-0267. Again, here's Dr. Levy and more of today's Caregiver Reality.
We're back. My producer was just saying during the break, he has his headphones on, I don't, that our music sounds creepy. I went out of my way to find that music because I really liked it, all right? And so those of you out there, send in your comment to info@caregiverreality.com. I'd like to see whether or not I can keep it or whether or not I have to go change it. If I were going to change, I would probably, if I could get away with it, find something from the Rolling Stones. That was supposed to be as close to Alfred Hitchcock as I could get without getting involved in a copyright, who I loved and is always the person who's out there investigating.
Big fan.
Yep, I am too. You know, one of the things, we talk about caregivers, that's all we talk about. One of the big problems that we have in America today is caregivers who are also working. And yesterday, a very important study came out from Employee Benefits News, who is one of the standard bearers about what's going on out there. And there's something that is called presenteeism. This is the first and last time you have to hear it. It's the opposite of absenteeism. When you don't show up at work, it's very obvious either that you cut class or you're not feeling well. But there are plenty of people that come to work and have the flu, and that's a big disservice to everybody. But there are a lot of people who are caregivers who have to come to work every day because they got to earn a living. But a piece of that day, every day, whether it's an hour, a half an hour and a half, are sitting there worried about their loved one at home or their loved one in a facility, whether or not things are getting done while they're gone, whether that's Meals on Wheels, whether it was scheduling a doctor's appointment. And what that has done in the workplace has so reduced productivity because you're other directed. We used to think it was bad enough when you took a 10-minute break to go to the water fountain. Now imagine what it's like to have a percentage of your workplace. And when I wrote my first paper on presenteeism, which was almost 8 years ago, and I updated, but we thought there was about 20% of the workplace was caregiving. according to Employee Benefit News yesterday, 35% of the average workplace is dealing with caregiving. That is an enormous amount. 1/3 of your employees are dealing with caregiving. I'm not saying all of it is elder care, because many of it is spouses and people taking care, as I've said, of people younger than that, who are dealing with children that have autism, that were born special need. It doesn't make a difference. Caregiving is caregiving. And the Equal Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, is beginning to really start to crack down, just as they did, as you and I were talking earlier, Paul, just as they did with gender discrimination 25 or 30 years ago, where there was that glass ceiling for women. There seems to be this automatic response that if you're a caregiver, you're not doing a great job because you're other directed. You may not be able to pick up and travel. And this was a real eye-opener, that caregiving in the workplace, not only by jumping from 20 to 35%, but what they said when they did their last survey in 2009, and they did this one, just at the end of 2013, that caregiving in the workplace had actually jumped 400% from where they had shown it to be. And going forward, one of the things that we're trying to do is deal with employers to recognize that some of their best employees are saddled with caregiving and that they didn't choose to have that happen. And now that we have an aging workforce, people that need to work longer, that want to work longer, almost by necessity, we can understand why there's more caregiving. And now that we have more chronic disease that's falling on the backs of boomers and millennials, then we're seeing that spreading more into the workplace and getting younger and younger. And when people think they can't raise their hand and say, I'm having a problem, I'm a caregiver, because they're worried that they're going to lose their job as a result of it, we have a very serious problem. The world has a very serious problem. And this is one of the things that we're going to be advocating for over and over again, is a recognition in the workplace of how many people are doing it.
Well, and sometimes it's subtle. Two people up for a promotion, both qualified. One is a caregiver, one is not. Which one gets the promotion?
Well, if the caregiver has made themselves known, more than likely they may not get the promotion. There was an ad, Paul, not an ad, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. I've mentioned it to you. And they were discussing productivity and caregiving in the workplace. And this was at a Ford assembly line in Michigan.
Yes.
And the foreman said, see that guy over there? And they were pointing to somebody along the line. If he's having difficulty with his grandmother today, I'm building a lousy car, because he's not concentrating on what he needs to. He's worried about his grandmother and his responsibilities and what's going on. So there's recognition in the workplace. One of the problems is they feel that the problem is so big that they don't know how to get their hands around it. And really...
They being who?
The management. Even though they may be suffering from caregiving themselves, they think the problem is so enormous, what do? And historically, they've always wanted to see if it was an employee assistance benefit that they could understand if they paid 10 cents a life a month, what was their return on the investment? Well, this isn't a return on investment. This is taking your in-place workforce and recognizing the problems that they're going through and returning productivity. If I were selling caregiving in the workplace, I would say to them, don't pay me anything. But let me have half of the productivity in terms of dollars that returns to the bottom line. I would be a very wealthy person. And so when we talk about the ability of the American worker to get things done, we have to recognize that there are things that are going on with them that just defy right now recognition.
I would think this has some significant legal implications down the road.
Oh, it does. And as the Equal Opportunity or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission gets further involved, they're going to start to make the same discrimination arguments. And at that point, the workplace is going to have to smarten up. And one of the comments they made is not so much that the workplace is ignorant, they don't know what to do. And there are really some very basic steps. It's not rocket science to recognize caregivers, run some support groups, have an open line. Employee assistance programs, I take nothing away from it, but just having somebody tell you where stuff is. Oh, here's a nursing home, and here are some geriatric case managers who do a wonderful job, but you don't even understand why you need them. Or what it is that you're supposed to do.
Back to the issue of education. It all comes down to educating the caregiver.
Right, and it's the ABCs of caregiving. That's what we discuss in the book. That's what we talk about all the time. You don't hear us do a lot of legal speak. We don't do a lot of psychobabble, and I mean that respectfully. We're talking about the same stuff, mashed potatoes and gravy, that are the basics of every meal that a caregiver needs to understand so that they can do their job but also live their lives.
And they feel invisible on the job. When these folks that are caregivers, myself being one of them, you really feel I have to watch what I'm doing because somebody else is watching what's going on.
Right. I'm really very lucky that I work for myself, because I recognize my caregiving in the workplace.
Tough boss, though.
Yeah, right. I don't give, there's no time off. But, folks, we want you to know that we are fully aware that caregiving is everywhere, that caregiving is not disease-specific. Today I was speaking with the medical research charities that represent 25 of the major illnesses in this country. And one of the things they feel that they're missing, and that we're going to try and link up with them, is because we have all of these diseases that we're doing research on, that their folks are doing research on, but what do you do for the caregiver while you're waiting for the cure? And so if we have the opportunity, we're going to try and synergize with them and bring caregiving to all of those healthcare organizations, those disease-based organizations, because they will take care of educating the caregiver about the disease, and we're going to bring them through the ABCs of caregiving, because it really doesn't make a difference what it is you're dealing with.
Completes the circle.
It absolutely does. It's the missing gap. And Paul, you and I talk about it all the time, whether you got $1 million or you got $10. It's the missing piece of what you need to do. And money will not solve the emotional stress and what you go through. You can buy all the help you want, but if it's your mom and you're worried about her, then dollars cannot solve the problem, and it's not something that an executive can delegate to his secretary to do. You're invested in it. And so as we get near the end, I want to say, Paul, thank you. I'm sorry I kind of out-talked you tonight, but to the world out there, I think you see what we're talking about. It's not our mission. It's our passion. We are caregivers, Paul and I. We know what we're talking about. I deal with them every day. Paul deals with them every day. We are extremely sensitive to what is going on out there, and it is our passion to bring you what we know, and what we know are the right things that you need to know. And so we've only got about 30 seconds left. So I want to say to Palm Beach, America and the world, catch us if you didn't hear it all on caregiverreality.com. It'll get posted in about the next 20 minutes. And that we'll see you next week here on WBZT 1230 AM. And that's us. Good night.
Have a great week.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Caregiver Reality. Each week, Dr. David Levy, a gerontologist with over 25 years of experience, providing practical, realistic help to caregivers struggling to keep up with the needs of a loved one, unable to care for him
Weather
or herself.
every 10 minutes from 6 a.m. until 3 p.m. 1230 WBCT.
West Palm Beach.